Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. And we are back in Luke chapter 7 again this morning. So if you have a Bible, I'd like to invite you to take it. Let's all turn together to Luke chapter 7. I'm not going to read the entire section like I did last study. So we're just going to look at the portion of Luke 7 that will be most pertinent to the portion of this section we're going to look at. So that's Luke chapter 7, and we'll read verses 1 through 5. Here's what the scriptures say. Now when he had ended all his sayings in the audience of the people, he entered into Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant, who was dear unto him, was sick, ready to die. When he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant. And when he came to Jesus, they besought him instantly, saying that he was worthy of whom he should do this, for he loveth our nation, and he hath built us a synagogue. Now, yesterday we talked about some introductory material and how Luke's gospel is unique in the way that he presents the material about Christ's life and ministry. The purpose is he wants to strengthen the faith of a man named Theophilus, who is a Gentile. So there are a lot of details that Luke records that might be unique to Luke that weren't necessarily recorded in Matthew or in John, because he's really trying to minister to a very specific kind of person. Now, when we talked about our introductory thoughts, there were three words that I asked you to remember that are important for understanding the passage in front of us. The first word is the word authority. That word authority is important because Jesus is going to demonstrate his authority, specifically his authority over sickness, his ability to heal someone. And really, this is a major theme in the verses we're looking at. The second word that's very important is the word mercy. The motivation for why Jesus was going to do what he was going to do, the way he was going to go about it, was mercy. The man wasn't going to earn the right or the privilege to have Jesus perform the miracle. Jesus didn't do it because of something in the man who was sick or something in the people who came to him. He did it purely out of his mercy. And so his kindness, his compassion toward a man who is hurting is really demonstrated in these verses. And the third detail, and I feel like this is a very important part or stream within this text, is the issue of perspective. We're going to see a contrast between the perspective of the man who sends them, the centurion, and the people who were sent to Jesus, the religious leaders who had experienced really good things from this centurion and him building their synagogue and him being very kind to them. What I'd like us to do is jump into the next form of detail here in these verses. And I want us to focus in on the fact that there's a man who is sick. And this is an important part of the storyline. Who is this person? Who does he work with or for? Why does Jesus take an interest in this person? So in order for us to do that, let's look at the details very carefully. In verse 1, he says, when he ended his saying, a certain centurion's servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. In Matthew chapter 8, we see that Matthew tells the same story, though he gives us a little bit more detail about the person who's sick. It says in verse 6 of chapter 8 in Matthew, Lord, my servant lieth at home sick of the palsy. He is grievously tormented. Now, the palsy is referring to someone who was more than likely paralyzed. And what we know later on in these verses is that the way that the centurion refers to his servant, he talks to him as someone who is like a son to him, someone who's probably younger than he is. And so what we have here is probably a young man who had been strong and vibrant and had worked for the centurion. He had a very dear relationship to the centurion. And all of a sudden, either he's gotten sick or he's had a terrible accident and he's paralyzed. He can't move. He's laying on a bed. There's nothing that anybody can do for him. He's in a very helpless position. And this man is very grieved by that. And he's saying, my only hope is to appeal to Christ. He's coming into this city. I'm going to appeal to him. So that's really the sense of what's going on here. Second thing I want you to notice is the difference between the servant's status, legal status, and the relationship that he had to the centurion. Whenever Matthew and Luke refer to this individual who is sick, they refer to him as a doulos. A doulos was a servant or a slave, a person who was in bonds. And so he was a person that in the Roman Empire had no legal standing. He was a slave and he had no rights. And that was a terrible position for this person to be in. And he's referred to that way both by Matthew and Luke. But then we see how the centurion refers to this person who is his doulos. He refers to him as a paidos, and that Greek term means someone who is a son, someone who is very dear to him. And so what it shows you is that while this man, young man who is paralyzed, has no legal standing, he is dear to the centurion. The third thing I want us to notice in these verses is why this is such a significant issue. Now, there is a point in which people getting sick, people having accidents, people being close to death, these are very normal occurrences in a fallen world. We don't get shocked when a person has an accident. It may catch us off guard, but we recognize in a fallen world bad things happen. We don't like to dwell on those things. We don't like to think on those things. But when things happen, it stuns us. It catches us off guard. In fact, last night we were watching a football game, Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals with my boys. And there was a young player, 24 years old, and he had a cardiac arrest. I don't even know what his status is. And the truth is that is an unusual thing in the sense that here's a young and vibrant and athletic young man, but there's also a sense in which these kinds of things happen all the time. Well, why is it that Jesus takes interest in this particular man? And why is it, out of all the people that could have been healed in that community, this is the one that Jesus heals, and this is the one, out of all the stories that Luke could have recorded, this is one that he takes the time to give the details. Well, it's because of who came to Jesus, why he came to Jesus, the way he came to Jesus, and who ultimately was there. It's because he's trying to appeal to a Gentile Theophilus to say, look, it's not just that the gospel is true, the gospel is for you. It's not just that Jesus has power and authority and the ability to heal, but Jesus is also compassionate and he's merciful. And when he sees people in need, his heart is moved with compassion toward them. That's really why this is such a significant story. So let's camp on this for just a moment about the centurion. What do we know about centurions in those days? Well, if you do a little bit of research about the history of the centurions in Judea in those days, there really were not a lot of Roman centurions in Judea in those days. The ones that were assigned there would have oftentimes been there working with law enforcement or something like that. But a centurion was a very powerful individual, a Gentile, a Roman more than likely, and he was a military man. He was somebody that got into that position because of his valor, because of his boldness, because he was a man of war. He was a person who had a lot of money. He was a person who had a lot of authority. He managed 100 people. And what's amazing about the financial side of that is that a Roman soldier would have received double the typical wage of a person who was a daily worker, maybe a carpenter, person working out in a field, a farmer. They would have received double the average wage of a person that was a laborer in Israel in those days. The centurion would have been paid the same amount as the entire group that he managed. So this is a wealthy person. This is why he had the ability to go and to actually build a synagogue for the people there in that city. This is how he endeared himself to the people of that city. Another thing that's important to notice is that with the money and with the nature of the job that the centurion would have done, a lot of times these were people who were very harsh. They were known to be ruthless, not the kinds of people that you would want to have to work under or that you would have to interact with on a regular basis. And many times, the people that were the servants, the bondservants, the slaves in the household of a centurion, these people were the people that had been conquered. These were people that would have been like the spoils of war. And we don't think in those terms in the modern world anymore, and we're thankful that this is not a common practice, certainly not in our nation. But the fact is that was the reality of the world that these people lived in. So when a man who has this kind of money and this kind of authority, and he's a Gentile, is living in Judea, and he has this kind of compassion for the Jewish people, and this kind of compassion for an individual who was a servant in his house, it speaks very highly of this man's character as a person. It tells us he was interested in the Jewish faith. It tells us that he was interested in the Jewish scriptures. It tells us he was interested in the way that the people worshiped. And it tells us that there was something that was the source of a difference in the way that he related to people. And I want to kind of come back to that, in just a moment. But think about this. Very unlikely person to be loved by the Jews. Very unlikely person to show the kind of kindness that he did toward a servant. Very unlikely person that would have known about Christ, that would have gone to Christ, that could have actually gone to Jewish religious leaders and said, could you go on my behalf to Christ? This is a very unlikely person. And what that tells you is that Luke says this is a great story from the life of Christ, a miracle that he performed, an interaction that he had with people. This is one that's really going to resonate with this man Theophilus, and it's going to really strengthen his faith that Jesus is Messiah, that he has the full authority and the ability to do these things. He is kind, he is good, he is compassionate, and the gospel's not just true, the gospel is for this man Theophilus and for his Gentile brothers and sisters. So there's a lot we've talked about that are a part of this storyline. The question is, what do we take away from it? What are the final thoughts that we have? And let me share with you a couple of things that I thought about as I reflected on this portion of the story of Christ healing this servant who was very dear to the Roman centurion. The first that I would like to say is that it amazes me how sometimes the world shames those who walk with Christ. Now, I'm not saying that it's always that way, and I'm not saying that it's that way as a general rule, but I am telling you that there are clearly examples of Christians who live less like Christians than the world around them. This man and the story that is being written down by Luke, he stands really not just as a testimony for the power of the gospel and how it transforms people, but he really stands as a contrast, you could say a testimony against the Jewish people in that community who had access to so much truth, so much opportunity, and they rejected what they were given. We're new creatures in Christ. We have the Spirit of God. We have the Word of God. We have the church body. We have so much knowledge and so much information. The question is, do we live in the light of the position that we have in Christ? Or does the world really put us to shame by the way that sometimes just in common grace, they live their lives? The second thing that I think is very interesting is it sets us up to see the heart of the passage and this perspective issue. Because what it shows us is that this Gentile man, this man who was a Roman centurion, was a man who had very benevolent character. And that is the basis through which the Jews will appeal to Christ to say, you need to heal a servant because he's a good man. Amazingly, by the end of the passage, the man's going to say, I'm unworthy. And so what it tells you is that though he was a person that really did have a character that was very different than his peers, in fact, it was even, you could say, superior to the Jewish people that had access to all this truth around him, he was not a man who appealed on the basis of his own righteousness and his own goodness. That's a very important piece to this story. A third thing that I'd like to show you is that this shows you that when it comes to issues of character and integrity, this is a complete package. When a person is a person that has poor character, or a person is a person that has good character, the reality is that is where what's going on under the surface, inside the person, what's in the heart of them, it comes out in those circumstances. And we like to be a people who kind of isolate all this out. But the reality is the reason that this man was so kind to the Jewish people, the reason he took an interest in their synagogue, and the reason he was so kind to his servants is because he was a man who had faith. In fact, Jesus marvels at the kind of faith that he has. In other words, you cannot separate the character of the man from what produces the character, and that is that he believed in the Messiah with so much less information than the Jewish people around him. He believed in the Messiah, and Jesus even marvels at that particular issue. And then we need to also see that it is that root issue that is really the most important thing. It's not the fact that he built a synagogue. It's not the fact he was kind to his servant. It's why he took interest in the Jewish people. It's why he treated his servant in bonds as someone who was a dear son to him, someone he cared about his well-being. He was kind. He didn't just treat him like he was a piece of property. What was the source? What was the root of that behavior? The reality is it was his understanding of who Christ was. It was the fact that he had faith. It might be that in the new year, as you think about behavior, good and bad, that you get very focused on the symptom or very focused on the fruit. And we need to recognize that fruit is not where the good and the bad ultimately lie. It's where the heart reveals itself. And so if we've got a problem in what we do and in the way that we think and the way that we respond in circumstances, we have to go deeper. We have to go to the source. We have to address the source. My prayer is that God will help us to do that. I hope that this session or this portion of our study was very encouraging to you, that it'll challenge you today, make you think about some things, and ultimately help you appreciate what's going on in the text all the more. Hope that you have a great rest of your day, and Lord willing, tomorrow we will see you again. Have a great day. Bye now.